Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Drew Lichtenberg. I'm the resident dramaturg at the Shakespeare Theater Company, and welcome to a special free episode of the Shakespeare Hour Live. Tonight is the second of two conversations that we will be having about the work of Thornton Wilder and Our Town in support of STC's current production. I am also not Simon Godwin, as you're probably aware, who, as we speak, is winging his way to merry old England to work on a production for the Royal National Theatre. So on Simon's behalf, I apologize that he's not here to join us and our fabulous guests, but I promise that Simon will be back on the Shakespeare Hour Live next season. Before we get started, a word of thanks to our sponsors. The Shakespeare Hour Live is made possible by the visionary support of the Beach Street Foundation. And the Shakespeare Theater Company's 2021-22 season has been made possible by Michael R. Klein and Joan Fabry and the Harmon Family Foundation. So thank you to our generous sponsors. Before I introduce our panelists, we have a sort of special treat for you tonight on the Shakespeare Hour. We're airing the world premiere of the new documentary, Thornton Wilder, It's Time, directed by one of our guests, Jim Knable, and prominently starring another, Tappan Wilder, who is Thornton's nephew and the executor of his literary estate. This documentary is brought to you free of charge by Wilder 125, the 125th anniversary of Wilder's birth, celebrating him and honoring his compassion, understanding, and radical imagination, which have opened doors for generations of artists to come. So please visit wilder125.com to learn more. I have a lot to say about this documentary, but I think it's best if we all now watch it without further ado. So please sit back, relax, and watch this fascinating documentary.
In 2007, 2008, I sat down to write a kind of epilogue to the Baltimore Waltz. And I went, okay, this is going to be an homage to Thornton Wilder. It's time. And I thought, I hope I still like the plays. Checked out the plays from the library, put it on my desk to reread it for the first time in 40 years, 50 years. Open up the book and my phone on the desk rings. I pick it up, strange man's voice.
Paula Vogel, this is Tappan Wilder. You don't know me from a hot rock. I am Thornton Wilder's nephew, but have the pleasure of being his literary executor and representing his intellectual property. And we're looking forward to doing a new edition for HarperCollins of a well-known play that I think you love. And I wonder whether you would be willing to write an introduction to it.
And I said, Mr. Wilder, I'm sitting here with the three short one-acts written by your uncle, about to write an homage to Long Christmas Dinner.
And she said, I would love to write the introduction to the Skin of Our Teeth.
That synchronicity, how do you describe that?
Our Town.
Happy Journey.
The Bridge of St. Louis Ray.
Pullman Car, Hiawatha.
Skin of Our Teeth.
Our Town and Skin of Our Teeth.
Skin of Our Teeth.
The Long Christmas Dinner.
And The Matchmaker.
We do have to talk about Our Town.
Now, there's some things you all know as well as I do, but you don't take them out often and look at them. We all know that something in the world's eternal. It ain't houses, it ain't names, it ain't earth, it ain't even the stars. Everybody knows in their bones that something in the world's eternal, and that something has to do with human beings.
The first three novels, the CABALA, the Bridge of St. Louis Ray, and The Woman of Andros, they're very much the work of an internationalist American. which is the way he's raised, and of course his studies and his experience in Rome in the early 20s at the American Academy.
When he was in his early 20s, he went out on a trip with his classmates to an archaeological dig, and they discovered 1,000-year-old Etruscan road. And at that moment, Thornton Wilder sort of saw how he was connected to those people who walked on that road 1,000 years from now. And there'd be people who walked on that road 1,000 years from then, and that the past was always a part of the present.
Thornton Wilder had a huge lightning strike when he published The Bridge of St. Louis Ray. We today don't realize what an extraordinary publishing success that was.
It starts with the story of the bridge collapsing.
It follows in 3 separate chapters the people who died on that bridge.
And then we start to find out who these 5 people are. And all these figures are all heading to the bridge that changes their destiny and their story.
There is a land of the living and a land of the dead, and the bridge is love.
We think of Wilder today as a playwright. Oh, and he also wrote novels. I think of him as a man who wrote a continuum of works. I'm interested in the ideas that run through all of them, however he cares to express them.
Turning to the theater, he had these cosmic instincts and broad thematic concerns, but he had to confine himself to the stage. So he was very aware that the theater, by definition, is a confined art form. And he calls attention to that fact.
Elmer, stop that automobile this minute! I don't go another step with anybody who says things like that. Arthur, get out of this car. Elmer, give him a $1 bill. He can go back to Newark by himself. I don't want him.
My first response to reading Happy Journey was, wow, Ma, Kirby reminds me a lot of my mom. What surprised me most about working on these plays is how well Wilder wrote his female characters. They are very nuanced. They have very rich interior lives, which is something that I don't see from many of his contemporaries. It's a delight to get to portray.
With Wilder, you can tell that he's thinking, okay, how do I exercise my muscles? I mean, when you read Hiawatha Pullman and then go forward into Happy Journey, you can see him talking to the writer in himself and challenging himself.
This is a Pullman car. Its name is Hiawatha, and on December 21st, it's on its way from New York to Chicago.
Pullman Car Hiawatha, it's a brilliant play. It's 24 pages, 28 characters, and a kaleidoscopic look at the universe.
I mean, hasn't everybody had that moment at the end of Pullman Car Hiawatha where you zoom out into outer space and you're like, oh my God, I am so small.
So Wilder, he's constantly reminding the audience of the limitations of the theatrical form. But you take, for example, The Long Christmas Dinner, he wants to talk about continuity. He doesn't want to talk about just one incident at one Christmas dinner. He has people come and go, and they leave, they die, new people arrive. So he tries to tell a story over time.
I feel that Thornton Wilder projects himself into the script as an observer. There's another person in that room at the dinner table, and it's the playwright, looking back and figuring out his own ancestry, that rich ancestry of the Wilders. So there's always a kind of invisible witnessing of the playwright's voice that's incredibly unique. I feel that in every play he writes.
This is the program for our town when it opened in Boston in January 1938. Our town opened in New York, and Thornton was with his sister Isabel. And in those days, there, of course, were a great many newspapers, and they had to get the review out into the early editions. There were many uneasy reviews about this rather odd play. But they get home, and the phone is ringing off the hook because Back in New York, there was a line at the ticket booth, and they brought the police in to control the line. So he had another extraordinary lightning success, this time as a playwright.
Every production I've seen of Our Town captures a different glimpse of what it means to be an American, of what it means to be human, of what it means to make sense of life.
The play is a series of moments, like a necklace of beads, and every bead is this moment, which is life passing. I worked on the 2017 production of Our Town that was trilingual. It was English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, and the play has been translated and done in other countries. But it's such a uniquely American experience to live your life multilingually. And that speaks to the universality of the dramaturgy of the play.
I'll be eternally grateful to a writer who I think may have written the greatest play ever written by an American. That is Our Town by Thornton Wilder.
I first read The Skin of Our Teeth in graduate school, and I remember reading it and being like, whoa, this is a lot of play. This is a lot of play.
Skin of Our Teeth is another whack experimental play that I would, imagine was written this year.
This is a play about the fate of humanity. Wilder wrote the play in 1939, 1940, as the world was clearly descending into chaos.
And yet, in the midst of that, of being on the brink of doom, against all odds, you have this hope for life, hope for the human race to survive.
It's a play that appears to be prophetic, and it sort of feels prophetic right now.
I think he's the first American to really introduce a notion of non-Western time, where time is endless, where time comes back again and again, where time is in a pattern. Thornton Wilder says it's not an individual's time. It's a social community time. It's us as social beings, and it's endless.
Hitchcock wants to do Shadow of a Doubt, and he wants Wilder to write the script because Wilder had written Our Town and was the master of life in a small town, and this is about murder in a small town. So he did it, and he and Hitchcock had a marvelous time together doing this. And then after the war, there's this odd duck of a wonderful novel called The Ides of March, which is a dramatic, fictional, epistolary novel. It's not like a typical narrative novel at all.
It's all about Julius Caesar and the period of time leading up to his assassination. And it's a series of letters between Caesar and, the many people in his acquaintance, as well as the people who are planning his assassination and their acquaintance.
The Queen of Egypt is approaching. Missy Crocodile is being fanned across the straits. My correspondence with Majesty has been as spirited as could be expected.
So I enjoyed The Matchmaker. Of course, it made a perfect book for a musical because it is in Western time.
So The Matchmaker is a farce, but The Matchmaker is also an odd farce. It has these moments where the farce comes to a screeching halt, almost like a record player scratching. And we encountered a character who speaks to us in direct address and gives us this incredibly vulnerable and articulate synopsis of where they're at and how they got there and what they're grappling with and what it means to them. And then we just jump right back on the train and we're back in the farce. Wilder succeeds in using that structure to make his point about these small moments being the essence of the human experience.
Get your props, because we are going to form the vehicle that is going to take us on that long journey. All right, let's begin.
For the last 15 years, I've been noticing increasing disinterest in what we call Broadway, and I just felt that I had ceased to believe in what takes place in the proscenium arch. I experimented in various ways of making the stage simpler and simpler, and then I found Mr. Quintero's theater and had so many admirable evenings in his theater that I decided to write for it.
We get to the end of his life, and he turns back to fiction to tell two remarkable novels. One is called The Eighth Day, which is going to win the National Book Award, which is his tribute to his country. It's an epic novel. And then he ends with my favorite novel, Theophilus North. He's not well. It takes him 1 year to write this novel, which is about Newport, Rhode Island. It's full of humor and fun and insight. And also it's a sermon about what's important.
Well, when we imagine him going to his desk every morning to work all morning, surely, for this immense output, I think another reason was that in his writing, he often in cipher put his daily life. He wrote about all around. A private journal.
I feel that Thornton Wilder was perhaps the last playwright who was allowed in the 20th century not to expose his autobiography.
I remember the moment I first laid eyes on him. I had arrived from California with Ruth Gordon and Garson Kanin for a little holiday on Martha's Vineyard. And we flew from Los Angeles to Boston, where we were met by Thornton, and he arrived in a beautiful white suit and a hat. And I remember him just bounding toward us at the airport, and I thought, what an astonishing looking fellow, that first. And then after he had hugged me, I was his.
My uncle was a traveling man, and he devoted his life to observing people. I mean, he was a great entertainer. And in one of his letters to me, he says, you know, your uncle's unusual. He listens. He really was a great listener.
So he very much was an outsider to family life. There was no model where he could be anything else but an outsider and a witness.
Well, he was a very lonely man, but it suited him. He worked it out. He worked out a remarkable life.
Thornton was such a broad and generous soul. It just speaks to another time when people drew from all sources to become the person that they are. And he drew heavily and deeply from these diverse sources, and music and literature and theater and the human heart.
How many words did Shakespeare use?
The report is that there's a census of 25,000 words at Shakespeare's hand.
Very few people of today would use a vocabulary of 25,000 words, would they?
Oh, the average person goes through life with 4,500.
That gives you an idea.
Wow, what a wonderful, thought-provoking, and ultimately celebratory and moving film about Wilder's work and Wilder, the human being. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Joining us tonight, first is Jim Knable, a playwright, songwriter, and writer of cultural articles and fiction. His latest play, Master Wilder and the CABALA, is a creative adaptation and origin story of Thornton Wilder's first novel. Previous plays of Jim's have been produced at MCC Theater, Soho Rep, Woolly Mammoth Theater Company, Actors Express in Atlanta, New Jersey Repertory Company, Target Margin, and elsewhere. He has written for publications such as the Brooklyn Rail, Tablet Magazine, the Stage Directors and Choreographers Journal, and the Thornton Wilder Journal. And he is the staff writer for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. I hope I didn't butcher any of those pronunciations, Jim. Jim, are you there? Hello.
Hello. How are you?
And Jim, if I may be so bold to ask, where in the world are you joining us from tonight?
I mean, obviously I'm in Brooklyn, New York. You can tell by my very real brick backdrop here.
Yeah, look at that. The beautiful kind of brownstone architecture for which Brooklyn is so famous. And this being a celebration of our town, but also all things Wilder, I'm wondering if I could put you on the spot with a kind of favorite work of Wilder's, or one that you would recommend to people who may know our town and Skin of Our Teeth, but maybe not the whole canon of Wilder's works.
I mean, I hate to say it depends on who it is we're talking about, but the first couple that jump to mind are actually the Ides of March. Is a really fun one to check out if you know something about classical literature or important figures in Roman times, and then also have a sense of humor that's kind of wry. That's a fun one to jump into. The CABALA is an enjoyable first novel worth checking out. I would, as far as plays go, highly recommend the short plays that were covered in this documentary. Pulmakara Hiawatha is, there they are, right? Is an amazing play with all those characters and the whole universe exploding at once. So, I think the documentary hopefully gives my personal recommendations as well as the big ones.
Oh yeah, I think we very much get a sense of your own sensibility and aesthetic. And I was holding up like a nerd my own cherished, beloved volume 1 of the collected short plays of Thornton Wilder. Can't wait to talk to you more, Jim, but I also want to introduce Rosey Strub, Director of Programs for the Thornton Wilder Estate, and the personal manager for Playwright, Paula Vogel, who also appears in the documentary, and Ken Ludwig, a favorite of Washington local audiences. Rosey produces Paula Vogel's online play reading series, The Bard at the Gate, in partnership with the McCarter Theater Center, which I kind of like to think of as a cousin for the Shakespeare Hour Live, since both of those programs started, I think, during the pandemic, if I'm not wrong, and have continued to go on because they were serving a need. Rosey has worked for a range of organizations, including the Stage Directors and Choreographers Society, Ars Nova, the National Theater Workshop for the Handicapped, Summer Play Festival, or SPF, Soho Rep, and Yale University. At NYU's Kevorkian Center, she has produced the Kurdish Film Festival and an International Human Rights and Arts Festival with Peru's Grupo Cultural Uyachkani and Yale Rep. Did I get that pronunciation right? So Rosey, hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the introduction.
And if I can ask, although I think I know the answer to this, where in the world are you calling us from?
Also Brooklyn, New York.
Oh, interesting. So not the brownstone part of Brooklyn, New York, but very close, maybe.
No, the Way Wall Stone part of Brooklyn, New York.
And what of Wilder's works? Which of the kind of personal favorites would you recommend for people to give them a wider sense of Wilder and his writing?
Well, Jim has already said the one-act plays, but those are the pieces that always draw me back. I just think, especially the 3 classic one-acts, as we refer to them, Happy Journey to Trenton and Camden, Pullman Car Hiawatha, and The Long Christmas Dinner, are just mini masterpieces. And they're short. You can read all 3 of them in less than an hour. And I just think they're beautiful. So I always highly recommend those.
Yeah, and Michael Kahn, the former artistic director at Shakespeare Theater, used to get all wistful whenever I would mention the Wilder one acts. He would get this kind of far off look in his eye and seem very emotional and moved. So I think clearly they're also a cherished pieces for him. I'm curious if any of our viewers in the audience have seen productions of those one acts or have read them. We're certainly curious for your thoughts, comments, and questions about them. And finally, last but not least, I want to introduce Tappan Wilder, Thornton Wilder's nephew, who has served for 25 years as his literary executor, as well as the literary executor of all the Wilder siblings, if I'm not mistaken. Tappan plays, a similar role for the literary legacies of his father, Amos, and Thornton's three sisters, all of whom are also authors. Tappan has overseen major reissues of Wilder's 7 novels and major plays published by HarperCollins. With the late Donald Gallup, he compiled and edited TCG's editions of the short plays. Tappan and Rosey have revisited all of the acting editions of Wilder's plays, a multi-year project including the 2012 definitive version of Our Town, featuring corrections and special notes from Thornton. Tappan is a graduate of Yale College, holds an MA in American History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a master's in Philosophy and American Studies from Yale University. Tappan Wilder, are you with us?
I'm with you and very grateful and glad to be here. Thank you, Drew.
And Tappan, where in the world are you joining us from tonight on this?
Well, I think I'm about 3,000 miles away in Sausalito, California.
So keeping it saucy in Sausalito.
I get the prize for coming the furthest.
Right. Well, thank you for making the time and joining us. And I believe you mentioned in the documentary your own personal favorite novel of your uncle's. And am I right? Is it Theophilus North or?
Well, I've got 2 of them, actually, to tell you the truth. I'm also rather crazy about a novel called Heaven's My Destination and Theophilus North. I'm crazy about the humor in those books and the, as I said, the sermon. There's a sermon in both of them, too. I love those.
Wonderful. Well, I personally have a list that I'm going through mentally right in my head right now. And I've certainly been given Thornton Wilder's novels and read them in the past, and they're always a real treat. Imaginative, adventurous, deeply moving, and emotionally overpowering at times, and extremely learned. Also, I want to not be remiss in acknowledging that joining us tonight is STC's development coordinator, Sierra Culbertson, who is in the live chat. Hello, Sierra. How are you?
I am doing good, Drew. Thrilled to be back again this week.
And you were just saying that there are a few questions already in the chat about Thornton's life. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. I'll read them out and then perhaps our panelists can comment on them as they will. The first one is from Abigail that says, Mr. Wilder was a very worldly person. Where would you consider him the most from? And a second question from Terry Quist that says, I missed any references to Thornton's World War II service in the narrative, but the picture of Wilder in the Army Air Corps uniform led me to check the record. He was a decorated military intelligence officer during the war. I wonder if this life experience had any effect on his life or writing.
So we were actually talking just before we went live on the air. Tappan, you were saying that in 1939, right before Pearl Harbor, there was a production of Our Town in Japan. Is that right?
Yes, Our Town was an international, Grover's Corners, I think it's fair to say, was an international address rather quickly after it opened in New York. Most Americans don't realize that. And it was done in a number of countries legally and illegally. And it was in fact published in Japan in 1939. That would have been a year after Our Town opened. And there were productions in Japan, and one of them closed just a few weeks before Pearl Harbor. I mean, they didn't know Pearl Harbor was coming. You understand, but it just shows the Warsaw. There'd been productions and in Vienna and a number of countries. Yes, Thornton didn't, as he was very fond of the wonderful line, I don't want to write for my country, I want to fight for my country. So he pulled as many strings as he could, which he normally didn't, and he got himself made an intelligence officer in the Army Army Air Corps, and he was posted to North Africa and to Rome, to Caserta, and so he had almost a 3-year real experience in warfare. And he said, I will not write about it directly, but it will influence everything I write. And the first thing that he wrote was the Ides of March, which has been mentioned as a really extraordinary novel, an epistolary novel. Yes, our friend Caesar is there, and boy, is there a Cleopatra, let me tell you. That's another reason to buy that wonderful novel. But behind it all are deep questions about leadership and power. And that's my uncle's signature. He is a writer who, many great writers, he's like an iceberg. A lot of my uncle is underwater.
The question certainly of where Thornton was most at home, I think, is a very interesting one.
And he was decorated, number of decorations. That's absolutely accurate. But Jim can speak to the fact that those are some of the choices they had to make in telling the story. It's a complicated man, and decisions had to be made. Isn't that fair?
Yeah, Jim. In some ways, you only have 17 minutes to tell the story, and you have to leave things in and leave things out.
You were both taking the words right out of my mouth. But I really want to thank the person who was watching and noticed that photo, because we had access to this amazing archive of all these photos, as well as people to talk about Thornton Wilder. So what we couldn't necessarily cover in terms of all the details, and think of this as like the tip of the iceberg, this short documentary. But there are so many things to possibly look at and say, hey, was he actually in service? And then to look him up so I really commend that viewer for doing that and encourage more of that. That's great.
And just to follow up while we're on you, Jim, you talked to people like A.R. Gurney and Paula Vogel, who I think of as really some of the most important writers of the late 20th and 21st century, these kind of living legends of American theater. But you also talked to younger directors, people like Aaron Arbus, who directed this sterling production of The Merchant of Venice that we did earlier this season at the Shakespeare Theater, and Lileana Blain-Cruz, who has this luminous production of The Skin of Our Teeth at Lincoln Center right now.
Yeah.
First of all, what did you learn from talking to them? What do you think it is about Thornton's work that continues to resonate amongst younger artists today?
Well, it's really interesting because some of the people that we talked to, the directors, had some familiarity with Thornton Wilder, and usually it was by discovering him sometimes in college or in grad school. I think Lileana was talking to us about her discovery of not only his plays, his novels, but also his letters, his correspondence between Gertrude Stein and he, especially. So Thornton Wilder is a writer who finds people when it's the right time for him to be found by them, it seems like. And I think that's really true for these younger directors and everybody else that we talk to, right down to the cast members of the short plays. It's a Columbia University production. Some of them were, fairly unfamiliar, but through the process of working on the plays, really came to know Wilder and to want to know more.
Right. And Rosey, as the director of programs for the Wilder estate, I'm wondering if you could speak to maybe some of the logistical challenges maybe, or decisions that you faced, as well as Jim, in assembling this documentary, because I imagine you had a large list of people you could talk to. So how did you start to narrow it down in terms of reflecting Wilder now and also for the last 125 years?
That's a big question, Drew, but I'll try to jump in. I want to say one thing quickly, and that's the one person that is not here with us today that I just want to give a big shout out and thank you to is Amanda Woods, who was the producer of the documentary and really did all of the heavy lifting in terms of all of the logistics for making this documentary happen. And it was actually her idea. As we were planning the celebrations for Wilder's 125th birthday, she said, we need to have like a trailer. We should just something short that we can share a little bit more about Wilder and have that, so that's how that was the genesis of the idea. But then as we started talking to people like Lileana, like Paula, like all of the actors at Columbia, we started to realize that this was going to have to be a little bit longer than we anticipated. It was just such a big story to tell. And I really have to commend all of our, Duke Berger also was the production editor on the piece. So he and Jim really kind of worked in tandem to put it together. But I will say that I think one of the difficulties was taking the existing footage that we had, and so you mentioned the interview with A.R. Gurney. So the A.R. Gurney interview, the footage we have obviously from Edward Albee, and the Mia Farrow footage was all footage that was pre-existing. And the Mia Farrow interview and the A.R. Gurney interviews were done by a gentleman by the name of Ken Whitty for a previous larger project. There are so many more of those interviews that exist with people like Marion Seldes. Tappy can give us the litany of all of the amazing people that were interviewed for that project. So they were able to take snippets from those interviews and then some of the historical footage of Wilder, which we really wanted to have like his face and his voice. There's so little video footage that exists of Wilder. So we wanted to get as much of that in as possible. And then, taking these current perspectives from people like Lileana and Paula and Logan. And so, I didn't have anything to do with finding ways to put all of that together. That was all the filmmaking team. But that was definitely one of the things we faced was, how do you wrap your arms around this person? And what do you choose to put in the documentary, and what do you have to let go for another project? So I will say there is so much more that we have, and we only had a short amount of time to put this together. So I think they did a great job of taking what we could and kind of giving us a taste of who this man was, for people to kind of explore more.
Well, I would, in my opinion, I think you succeeded brilliantly. It's a shining example and extremely evocative at times of not just Thornton, the human being, speaking about working with Jose Quintero. I love that on that TV show, but also the kind of times in which he lived and how in many ways he shaped the times and the art of not just this country, but around the world. Tappan, you talk about the continuum, as you call it, of Wilder's work, that he was somebody who wrote in a variety of different mediums, novels, plays, short works, epistolary novels, historical novels. Where would you place our town on this continuum? And I wonder if there are any stories you can tell us about how Wilder came to conceive of and write a play like Our Town. I'm thinking here maybe of the specific links between Wilder and New Hampshire, but there's also Wilder and the world. And I love the Albee question because he's speaking, I believe, to the MacDowell colony in New Hampshire, isn't he? When he's calling Our Town the greatest play that has ever been written by an American. So there's a very specific context in which New Hampshire functioned in Wilder's life and in Albee's life, who Wilder had a kind of influence on.
Well, yes, that's a marvelous question and a big one. I think you heard mention, and those who watched this who just saw the movie heard about Pullman Car Hiawatha. One of my, like everybody who sees it, it becomes one of their favorite short plays. And just for the record, the Pullman Car Hiawatha is this train goes from New York to Chicago and goes into the universe to get there. But along the way, in northwestern Ohio, it goes through a town called Grover's Corners. And that's why in certain parts of Ohio, they think Grover's Corners is where Our Town was conceived. And Thornton's, where does Our Town fit? Well, kind of in the middle of his life, if you will. His default position, Drew, as a storyteller, as a born storyteller and fabulist, was drama. But he makes it hugely as a novelist, and the novels are very spare, not a lot of adjectives in them, and you can see the dramatists at work in them. And then he turns, the minute he finishes those, he gets this marvelous contract that every great novelist dreams of, a lecture contract. He contracts 144 lectures throughout the United States over X number of years. And of course, he's always asked, what do you want to do, Mr. Wilder? And he said, well, I want to finish the next novel, and then I want to write plays. Keeps telling, that's his answer. And he does indeed turn to writing those 3-minute plays, which are the tool chest for what he with which he develops our town. And there are death scenes in his last novel and in one of those plays, Pullman Car Hiawatha, where somebody dies and comes back on their way to death or comes back from death, which is a cue to what's ahead, when he's wrestling all the time from even a very young man and in early little 3-minute plays with what I call the drive to write the every man or every person play. And it comes out of his experiences, his extraordinary knowledge of drama. He's always hailed as the most erudite of all American dramatists, and he probably was. He knew languages and whatnot. And his experiences, out of his background, and out of this drive to try to find what is precious and explore what really matters in the everyman theme, he creates this village in New Hampshire, which he was experienced with because of his family and also his experiences at McDowell Colony, but which is in Peterborough, New Hampshire. But he also wrote a good deal of the play in Switzerland because he was spending large times abroad. So it's a world play set in an American setting, and it's right about in the middle. You wanted a personal question? I don't want to, we've got a wonderful panel here. Sure, I can tell you stories, and one I enjoy telling is the fact that it was at my parents' wedding that he discovered something that everybody else seemed to know, the old wives' tale that the groom does not see the bride until they meet at the altar. And his future mother-in-law made a big deal about that, and he was very pleased. He said it was just what he needed for a work he had conceived. And that marriage occurred in Moorestown, New Jersey, which is why my mother's wedding dress is on display there in the Historical Society. So it's nice to know that our town also has some New Jersey roots, right? A little Moorestown, New Jersey.
Well, and what you're saying, Tappan, is that Emily and George, that your parents are in some ways the model for Emily and George, or for that moment in Act Two.
We Act Two, in our town, I can't go over to see my girl. Oh, no. The bride's mother says, you sit right here now. You talk to Editor Webb, and you won't see Emily till you see her in church. In my parents' case, it was a garden wedding. But in the afterword that I've contributed to our town, I stuck a picture of my parents' wedding in there, and the story is told.
I mean, that is fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. That will completely inform now the way that I think of that moment in the play, probably forever. But I also think it's interesting that Wilder is so interested in social mores and customs, these little tiny rituals that maybe we unthinkingly practice. And it makes me think, of course, of the famous line of the stage manager towards the end of Act One. This is the way we were in our living and in our dying. This is the shape of our life in the specific contour, but also in a large cosmic sense.
Yes, I mean, I could go on and on about my views that you talk about the continuities across all his art forms. And we have to bring music into it too, Drew. It's very important. I think he explores, as I'm fond of saying, in a rather, it would seem rather casual way, what is it that allows us to get out of bed every day? Life is hard. The scars on our hearts as we grow older grow deeper. And he explores love and marriage and family and society and politics of the Ides of March, and memory, very important. Memory is very important. And he brings to it this enormous background. He loves to borrow experience from writers before his time. His knowledge of the classics is deeply studied, for example, but the Bible, Eastern literature, this vast knowledge filtered through his own experiences and to tell stories. And they appear to be timeless, and people love them because in the end, they're good story. He's a wonderful storyteller.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Sierra, there's another question, and I think it's for maybe Jim about the making of the documentary. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a couple questions from our audience about the making of the documentary. The first is curious to know if there's a particular photo or quote that was found in the making of the documentary that surprised you or stuck with you the most. And then another from our viewer, Robin, that says, any plans for a longer documentary?
Yeah. So, I mean, Rosey's mentioning, Marion Seldes and all this footage that exists in this amazing archive, but also Jim, you were kind of making a thoughtful face as you were thinking of things that you found while making it that might have surprised you.
That was my "can I think of one" face. There are many. So I'll take the second question first and say that we first made a cut that was about 27 minutes long. That felt like it for me, it was exciting, and it felt like, oh, this could be like a PBS special or something. It definitely is more and more to tell. We wanted to reduce it to a more manageable size for this project. But there certainly could be a much greater documentary, or, for Wilder, a series of documentaries, because his life is so rich and his work is so rich, and spans so many genres and mediums even. As Tappy was talking, I was thinking about, he's kind of like one of those painters like Degas, who has many iterations that he's exploring, that you can watch him explore throughout plays. Like in Pullman Car Hiawatha, you have the Harriet speech is like the prototype for the Emily speech. The M marrying N comes up in a couple different plays, including, that was originally an idea for the title of Our Town before it became Our Town. So I think there's so much to be mined in terms of learning more and telling more about Thornton Wilder, and also finding out about Thornton Wilder as a character. Because he did not present himself in the same way that Tennessee Williams, really presented himself to the world. He was quieter in many ways, but among his friends, and I think you see this some in the documentary, he was the life of the party. And so there's also that side of him to really explore and get to know. In terms of, surprises that came up along the way, because I kind of live in a very Wilder household in a lot of ways, and I've worked with Wilder before, I don't know if there were any specific surprises to Wilder, except to just be reminded that there's a web of Wilder that covers everything, and everybody has a way in. And I find that as I talk to people, whether it be that character is just like my mother, or that reminds me of the letter writing that I did with somebody, and it's just that he's a very accessible playwright and writer and artist, and that's just a wonderful reminder to have.
Yeah, the marriage of this deep erudition and to a certain extent cosmopolitanism, this international background that he lived, but also the all-American kind of accessibility of his writing.
Right, and that's something that Our Town has been fighting, and he's been fighting with Our Town, nearly since the beginning. That the first reaction was, oh, what a weird, crazy play. This is so strange. And then very suddenly it was, oh, this is the high school play everybody does. Oh, certainly it can't be that important. And then now we're again rediscovering. Oh, this is the most profound play ever written. It actually is very important. But that he accomplishes all those things to find the everyman and the incredible academic mind that he was, and to really marry them in a play that everybody can relate to, and also you can study from a very intellectual perspective and find as much satisfaction from, and all of the above. So,
yeah, I'm wondering, Rosey, if I could put you on the spot as the programs director. Have you and Tappan talked about a longer film, or is there anything else in the works from the Wilder estate? Are there other things connected with Wilder 125 that we should know about, or make sure that our audience knows about?
Well, we've talked for many years about having a longer Wilder documentary. There's so many stories to be told. I just wanted to quickly just go back to that first question that was asked by one of your viewers about his itinerant lifestyle that kind of started when he was a young child. That was like the story that I really wanted to dig in with this documentary. It was like, we decided we didn't want a cradle to grave documentary for this, But it's so interesting to think of this man who was growing up in China in the middle of the cholera epidemic, and he's by himself. He's a little kid. He's like, 11, 12 years old. And he's by himself on the continent because the rest of the family is, strewn about the place back in the States and other places in Europe. I mean, that to me, I find fascinating. And then, Tappy talks about this all the time, the fact that he was only at his home in Hamden, Connecticut, 100 and 150 days a year. And the rest of the time he was traveling everywhere and he was having adventures, and he had so many friends and so many like famous friends. So there's so many different perspectives. He spoke so many different languages. He was fluent in, Italian and Spanish and French and German. And he had, there were many decades where he was produced as much in Germany as he was here. I mean, there are just so many layers to the onion that we kept peeling back as we were making this documentary. There are so many stories to be told from so many different perspectives. So yes, we'd love to have a feature length piece about him. And there's so much material that exists that could be done. So yeah, American Masters, let's do it. What was the other question you asked? I'm sorry.
From your lips to PBS's ears, right? But yeah, you mentioned this maybe little known fact: the son of a diplomat, and he's in Shanghai and Hong Kong as a child. And I believe Tappan, doesn't he have to flee China because of the Shanghai Revolution in the early 20th century?
He actually has his experience in China. He went back and forth twice, and it amounts to about 2 years. But he was 1 year in a boarding school, Chifu, which was quite a lot was going on around Chifu at the time, and it gets baked into you as a young person. He was very young, then he came back to the United States. I'm fond of saying that he did not have to deal with revolting against one place or another, as great American writers have, who had to deal with their past. They mime it for the artistic value, and they had to get away from it, or they celebrate it. He seemed to be a little bit from everywhere. And then he coupled it with his travels. He was not right, and he built a home for his family in 1930. It was the first home his mother had ever had. That was in Hamden, Connecticut, next to New Haven. And that became his home, his base for the rest of his life, and he was to die there. But, he would roam as Europe as long spells, or Stockbridge, Massachusetts, or one of his favorite destinations, Newport, Rhode Island. And he spent nearly 2 years in Douglas, Arizona. He got tired of his nephew and friends asking him what he thought of saving whatever we were asking him about. He goes off to Douglas, Arizona for 2 years. That's on the Mexican border. It's a copper smelting town, and he basically is there for 2 years and writes his great novel, The Eighth Day. Thornton Wilder and Douglas is a whole story.
Yeah, there's another question from the chat, which I think it might be interesting, is because I think somebody brought up Tennessee Williams. What kind of relationship did Thornton have with his famous playwriting peers? Did he have a kind of social relationship with someone like Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller, who were younger than he was, or O'Neill, or was he very much a kind of person who kept to himself? I mean, you mentioned all of his famous friends. I can't think of someone who had a career like Thornton Wilder, writing a screenplay for Hitchcock, teaching at Harvard and University of Chicago, even though he was not a full-time professor, serving in the Air Force, stationed overseas with distinction. Right, he's kind of he reminds me of Ted Williams in a little way, where he could hit 400 and then he could go fly a fighter pilot.
I know Tappy's going to go at length, I'm sure, about all this. But
you go for it.
I think he starts with The Lost Generation. I mean, that's really kind of where he breaks out with Bridget St. Ray. And he is a contemporary of Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, and hanging out with them, writing letters with them, and then he keeps going, right? He keeps evolving. And but take it away, Tappy. I think you have more.
It's a wonderful question, and of course, no, he was not close to Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller. they had some sometimes semi-mean things to say about him. He lived in a different world. He really did. So those were not close friendships. But I think they were all members of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I can't remember when there were various elections. So at meetings, they would certainly see each other. And I think it's fair to say that his closest friends were more on the other side. He was a great. He had a lot to do with influencing Albie's decision to become a playwright rather than a poet, and he loved to be around younger people. It was enormously. There was a teacher in him all the time. And he always used to say, I'm just a teacher who writes on the part-time. This is ridiculous. He was a writer who happened to teach part-time. I think you'll agree with me, Jim. You've written a fine play about Wilder as he was in Lawrenceville School writing at night and writing his first novel.
Yeah, but he was, as a teacher, he was pretty incredible from all that we know, I think. But
yeah. And his criticism also, I mean, if anyone hasn't read Wilder's nonfiction writings, his fiction is unbelievable. His criticism, I should say, is unbelievable. And I think, Tappan, you were telling me there's a new volume of Thornton's nonfiction, not Tappan's nonfiction, that's going to be edited and coming out soon.
Well, no, it's in the works, and they're planning for it in the works. A very gifted young scholar, Professor Cimatori at Skidmore, has got the charge to do a new edition of Wilder's nonfiction, and is planning a volume which will be includes what's there as well as a good deal of material, I think, that he's exploring. He's a wonderful guy, and I think maybe you know him, don't you? You know him.
Oh yeah, Joseph Cimatori and I were in fact classmates at the Yale School of Drama, so I know Joe very well. And he's a brilliant scholar, brilliant mind, and I can't wait to read the results of his findings.
Well, I'm over the moon happy that somebody of his brains and distinction has agreed to take on a long overdue task to do right by Wilder's nonfiction.
Yeah. Well, I honestly feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours, but it is 8:30. So I do want to thank our esteemed panelists, Jim, Tappan, and Rosey, for joining us tonight. And I would encourage everyone watching this who hasn't read Wilder's novels or the works outside of the Pulitzer Prize winners to really spend some time with Wilder. I was very moved seeing the documentary by this line from The Bridge of San Luis Rey, which is, I think, the last sentence in the novel. There's a land of the living and a land of the dead, and the bridge is love, which is a line that I think will stay with me for a very long time. And it reminds me very much of things that he's writing in our town 10 years later. In many ways, Wilder keeps on telling the same story, but in different ways. And I think that's one of the reasons why we keep on coming back to Thornton Wilder's works. He was profoundly interested in the big questions, what it means to be alive, but also in the small questions, what it means to be alive right now. So these are the stories that I think we tell at the Shakespeare Theatre Company, vital stories and in audacious vocabulary. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Our Town is currently playing at Sydney Harmon Hall starting tomorrow night. Please join us on the Shakespeare Hour Live on Wednesday, July 13th. We will be discussing Red Velvet by the brilliant British playwright and actress Lalita Chakrabarti, which tells the remarkable story of Ira Aldridge, who during his life was one of the most famous performers of Shakespeare in the world and has for too long been forgotten. So we hope to see all of you with us right here on Zoom in July. There will be slides after the show tonight giving you further details, and join us next season as we continue to share stories that show us who we are, where we have been, and where we are going. Thank you again. Good night.